Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In this lecture, I will speak about the acid-base balance and how to make interpretation of blood gases. So this subject considered to be as continuation of the ventilation subject which we finished. I will speak about the importance of blood gases and the normal values, the effect of some factors like temperature, how to interpret about blood gas with some explanation, then how to calculate the compensation to be sure that the specific factor affecting the pH. So the importance of blood gas, as all of us know, it will reflect for us the assessment of the acid-base balance of the baby, the oxygenation, the ventilation, and oxygen saturation, which is not accurate in blood gases, and these are the respiratory function of the baby. We can also follow the level or the trend of electrolyte like sodium, potassium, or ionized calcium, and in some machine we can also follow the result of bilirubin, hemoglobin, or lactate. So the type of blood gases, the arterial, venous, capillary, all of them can give us the assessment of the acid-base balance, the CO2 and the other factor. But if you are looking for the oxygenation, the BO2, ABG is required. But take care that it is very painful when you are puncturing the artery, so take care, don't repeat it more than 2 times. During interpretation, you have also to consider the FiO2 at which blood gas is done and the temperature. The result of PO2, it may be the same for a baby who is receiving 21% and the other baby who is receiving 100%, but there will be a different interpretation. And also for the temperature, because the temperature will affect the PCO2 and the PO2. From physics we know that the lower the temperature, the higher the gas solubility, so the lower will be the result of PCO2 and the PO2. And this is very important, especially in babies who are under cooling therapy, like babies who are treated from HIE or prenatal encephalopathy. The level of the PCO2 and the pH will be affected, and the more the pH towards the alkalinity and the more the lower the PCO2, the dangerous effect on the developing brain of the baby and bad outcome with increase in the disability, especially if it is cumulative effect with more exposure to low PCO2. So for interpretation of blood gas at different temperature, we have to school with controversy whether we have to correct this result or not. The alpha state school don't correct, while the pH state school correct the body temperature, and I think the second school is better, especially in babies who are under cooling therapy. Temperature correlation for pH, PO2 and BCO2, as we said, the BCO2 and pH will be affected, it will be less, so the BCO2 will be 2 milli-mercury lower for each 1 degree lower than the 37, while the pH will increase by 0.015 for every decrease in the temperature by 1 degree. The affection on the PO2 is 5 milli less for each degree lower than 37. So it is very important for us, as we say, the pH and the PCO2. So if you have a baby who has temperature of 34 and the undercooling therapy, and then the PCO2 giving 39 and the pH is 7.36, which are normal, and the electrode temperature of the machine was 37. If we corrected, the 39 BCO2 will be 33, while the pH 7.36 will be 7.4. So more towards the alkaline and more hypocarbia, which are, as we say, dangerous. So we have to take care when we have a baby on cooling therapy. The normal value, as we know, the pH between 7.35 and 7.45, and the PCO2 between 35 and 45, bicarb 17 to 27, and in newborn we can consider 16 to 26, and in extremely birth weight 14 to 22. Base excess plus or minus 5. And you can find different in ICU according to their guidelines. They define the pH with little difference, especially in extreme preterm, especially when there is permissive hypercapnia considered. So we can consider 7.2 in extreme birth weight as normal and the little higher level of CO2. But in general, we will consider a pH of 7.4 as alkalosis and pH less than 7.35 as acidosis. So I will start to speak about the pH, and the pH is a negative logarithm of hydrogen ion concentration, and it is in direct relation with the bicarb. So the more the bicarb, the more the pH. So any abnormal increase in the bicarb will increase the pH, which is called metabolic alkalosis. And we will say metabolic because it reflects the change in the metabolic factor, which is the bicarb. While decrease bicarb will lead to metabolic acidosis. The second factor affecting the pH is the BCO2, which is a respiratory factor. So any increase in the BCO2 will decrease the pH inversely proportional, and it will be respiratory acidosis. While decrease in the BCO2 by washing CO2, it will cause alkalosis, respiratory alkalosis. So what about the base excess? We found many of our colleagues consider the base excess is the main factor to consider that this is a metabolic acidosis or alkalosis without looking to the PCO2, because we know that the base excess, it refers to the amount of base that if you add to 1 liter of the baby blood will return the pH to normal. But this at what? At 40 millimercury of BCO2, normal level of BCO2. So if the BCO2 is abnormally high or abnormally low, the base excess here will not reflect the metabolic component of that baby. And you have to depend on the level of bicarb. BCO2 in relation to the base excess through certain calculation by the machine. So the base excess, it is a calculated value, not measured value, and must be considered only if you have normal CO2. Now I will speak about the APG interpretation. And in the APG you will find the pH, BCO2, BO2, base excess, bicarb, hemoglobin, electrolytes, methemoglobin, lactate. All of these factors, around 11 factors, you have to look. Every factor of this must be looked and must be seen and interpreted. But here in this subject I will concentrate on the acid-base balance only. So when you want to interpret the blood gas, first you have to define, is it acidosis or alkalosis, and that will come from the pH. A pH more than 7.45 is alkalosis, less than 7.35 is acidosis. This is the first step. The second step, you have to define what is the primary problem. it is metabolic or respiratory or mixed. So by looking to the PCO2, you can define it is respiratory or metabolic or mixed. And if you have the bicarb level in the blood gas, it will also be helpful. But sometimes the blood gas coming with wash out and there is no bicarb, so the PCO2 and the pH, these two factors alone can be used. The third, after you define that this is, for example, acidosis and it is respiratory, you have to define is there any compensation or no. Is the body return or try to return with the acid-base status to the normal or near normal or no? And is it complete compensation or partial compensation? Then the other factor you have to look to the oxygenation through the BO2 only in arterial sample. When you are judging about the compensation, you have to put this rule in your mind that overcompensation is extremely unusual. Overcompensation is extremely unusual. So if you saw the pH is acidotic, it is extremely unusual to be as primary metabolic and from the overcompensation become acidotic. I will start to speak now about the first type, which is the primary respiratory disorder, and the respiratory disorder will be either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory acidosis, as we say, there is increase in the CO2 more than 45, so the pH will come less than 7.35, while in alkalosis the CO2 will be washed out less than 35, so the pH will be more than 7.45. So as you see here, the pH and the PCO2 move in the opposite direction, and the correlation between the CO2 and the pH is that for every deviation of the PCO2 by 10 millimercury in either direction, there will be decrease in the pH by 0.08 units in the opposite direction. Respiratory acidosis, when we diagnose, we have to look for the compensation. So there are two types of respiratory acidosis. Either it is acute respiratory acidosis or chronic respiratory acidosis. In the acute type, the pH will be acidotic because the PCO2 will be high, but here you will find that the bicarb and the base excess will be in the normal range because it is acute and there is no adequate time for effective compensation. Why in chronic respiratory acidosis the pH will be acidotic, but it will be near to normal in the acceptable range, while the PCO2 is the cause, it is increasing. You will find that the body as a compensatory, there is enough time for the renal mechanism to excrete more hydrogen ion and to create absorption of more bicarb, so it will try to return by the pH to a near to normal, so there is a compensation. You will see this like in chronic lung disease, chronic neuromuscular disorder, chest wall deformity, and extreme obesity in some children. The second respiratory will be respiratory alkalosis, where there is increase in the pH more than 7.45 by decrease in the CO2. So the decrease in the CO2 is the cause. And also there is acute alkalosis and chronic alkalosis. In acute alkalosis, because it is acute also, the bicarb and the base excess will be in the normal range. There is no enough time for compensation. While in chronic alkalosis, the pH level will be alkalotic, yes, but it is close to the normal, and the real compensation by decreased absorption of the bicarb will maintain the compensation effect. So in any acute there is no time, and in the chronic there is a time for compensation. So the other factor will appear in the chronic alkalosis or chronic acidosis. Example of alkalosis, like cases of hyperventilation due to pain, irritability, hypoxemia, maybe on ventilator with auto-triggering or auto-cycling, or if we are using aggressive mechanical ventilation with higher tidal volume. The effect of alkalosis is as bad as acidosis, acute hypocarbia, can cause cerebral vasoconstriction, later on BVL, also hypocalcemia, some electrolyte disturbance, hypokalemia, hypophosphatemia, and in severe cases cardiac instability or convulsion. Second type, which is a metabolic disorder, as a primary cause, will have also either metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, and because it is metabolic, it is affected by the level of the bicarb. So when the bicarb is less than 22, the pH will be less than 7.35, and it is metabolic acidosis. While when the bicarb is abnormal high more than 26, the pH will be shifted toward 7.45 above, and it will be metabolic alkalosis. And as you see here, the pH and the bicarb are in the same direction. And also as a compensatory, you will find the PCO2 will run in the same direction as a compensatory mechanism. In the metabolic, number one will be the metabolic alkalosis. It is uncommon, and usually it is due to loss of acid more than loss of bicarb, or increase in the bicarb reabsorption. And from pediatrics we know that either it is chloride responsive metabolic alkalosis, like which occur in mechanical ventilation baby with chronic lung disease, or chloride resistant metabolic alkalosis, like Bartter syndrome, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, the DOC type, or milk alk syndrome. The complication of metabolic alkalosis also, that if it is severe, it can cause hypoventilation to the level that we need to make a mechanical ventilation for the baby, and also it will make hypoxemia by the effect of alkalosis on the oxygen hemoglobin distribution curve by shifting the curve to the left. Metabolic acidosis, second type, and we have two types, the uncompensated type and the compensated type. The uncompensated type, here the pH will be less than 7.35 because of low bicarb, but you will find there is normal CO2 as the respiratory system is not compensating. There is no time for compensation by hyperventilation, and this can occur in cases like respiratory distress with PDA and extreme low birth weight in the first 3-4 days. There is increased production of acid and failure to eliminate this acid, and at the same time there is failure to reserve the bicarb. The compensated form, where the pH near to the normal, near to the 7.35, and also because it's metabolic there is low bicarb, but here the PCO2 will be washed to be less than 35 as a respiratory compensation. But as we said, the baby will never overcompensate, and so the pH can return very near to the normal but never become alkalotic. The third type is a mixed acid-base disorder, where you will find at the same time more than one acid-base disorder, like mixed metabolic and respiratory acidosis, where the pH is acidotic, the bicarb is low as a metabolic element, and the elevated CO2 as a respiratory element. Another example is the metabolic alkalosis. At the same time, there is element of respiratory acidosis, because the respiratory system is not free, like in case of chronic lung disease. The pH is alkalotic, bicarb is high, the BCO2 is still high, and here it is not a compensation. We cannot say this is a compensation for bicarb, because as we will see, if you calculate, you will find that there is more CO2 retention from the effect of the pathology of the lung. So there is respiratory element plus the alkalotic element. Compensation, and this is the main subject which we will speak in the next few slides, where the compensation means that the body will attempt to return by the acid-base balance and the pH to near normal. So if the primary problem is metabolic, so compensation will be in the other direction, but by respiratory. So metabolic acidosis will be compensated by respiratory alkalosis, and the metabolic alkalosis will be compensated by respiratory acidosis, and the reverse. If it is respiratory acidosis, the body will try to compensate by metabolic alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis to be compensated by metabolic acidosis, it is extremely rare. To know which is the primary pathology or the primary disorder and what is the compensation component. So you have to know and to remember the principle that normal physiological process of compensation, there is no overcompensation. And then we have to calculate what is the expected compensation, and this is very important to calculate the expected compensation, because if you consider that the acidosis, for example, is related to the respiratory and there is increased CO2, the magnitude of increase in the CO2 will reflect a part or all of the change in the pH. This must be calculated. So to define if there is another factor rather than the PCO2 as respiratory, or it is pure respiratory, and at the same time you can know how much the compensation. So we know the equation of CO2 plus water will become the bicarb, which will dissociate to produce hydrogen ion and the ion of the HCO3, and it is in continuous equilibrium, and by this equation we will build up all our calculation method. So in respiratory acidosis, we will find that respiratory acidosis is due to increase in the CO2. For every 10 millimercury increase in the CO2, there will be decrease in the pH. In the acute stage or in acute cases, the decrease in the pH will be by 0.08 unit, while in the chronic it will be less by 0.03 unit. And at the same time, the compensation by increasing the bicarb, it will increase up to 1 milliequivalent per liter, while in the chronic there is enough time to increase up to 3.5. These two equations are very important. You have to remember. If you cannot remember, so you have to put on your device or on your mobile. Some people like Dr. Hisham, he can memorize this very well. In acute cases, the expected bicarb is calculated as 24 plus the actual measure BCO2 minus 40. So this is the increment of the BCO2 divided by 10. So if the actual arterial blood gas showing that the BCO2 is 60, so 60 minus 40 equal 20 divided by 10 equal to 2 plus 24. So we expect the CO2, the bicarb, to be 26. While in chronic, there is addition of 4 more to get the expected bicarb. So this is the first two equation plus the fact that every 10 millimercury increase in the CO2 will decrease by 0.08 in the acute and 0.03 in the chronic from the pH unit. In respiratory alkalosis, the same in the acute. For every 10 mmHg decrease in the PCO2, there will be increase 0.08, while in the chronic increase by 0.17. And the calculation here in alkalosis is more to be accurate in the acute, not in the chronic. So I will consider that from this page we have now 3 facts: how to calculate the expected bicarb in acute and chronic acidosis, plus the role of every 10 mmHg increase in the CO2 will drop in acute cases by 0.08 from the pH unit. In metabolic disorder, so metabolic disorder due to either increase or decrease in the bicarb, so every change by 10 in the bicarb lead to a change of the pH by 0.14, and as we said before, in the same direction. So this is the rule number 4. So for metabolic acidosis, decrease in the bicarb by 1 milliequivalent will lead or associated by the PCO2 decrease from 1 to 1.5, and this very equation is the most accurate and famous calculation to calculate the expected PCO2 by multiplying the bicarb measured by 1.5 plus 8 plus or minus 2. You will find a lot of equation in different text, maybe over 50 way to calculate, especially in metabolic disorder, but I think this is the simplest way. The PCO2 equal to 1.5 multiplied by carb plus 8 plus or minus 2. In metabolic alkalosis, it is 0.7 multiplied by carb plus 20 plus or minus 1.5 to get the expected PCO2. And when we will try some example how to calculate, it will show you that it is very important. Till now it looks like dull equation, dull mathematic, but you will see when we are calculating now. For example, if you have a preterm baby, 26 weeks, and you find that the pH is 7.1, and the CO2 increased to 55. So what is the diagnosis? Here is the pH is low, acidotic. The CO2 is high, so it seems to be like respiratory acidosis. And unfortunately that the blood gas here show no bicarb or base excess or any other factor related to the metabolic element of compensation or as a cause, if there is any metabolic or not. So consider this one as a respiratory acidosis. But when we will try to see is this CO2 55 increment from 45 to 55, 10 are responsible to decrease the pH to 7.1, it looks no. So if we calculate, we will find that this 10 will decrease the pH but not to the level of 7.1. So what are the other factors which will decrease the pH to 7.1? It must be come from the effect of bicarb. So it looks like metabolic and respiratory acidosis at the same time, mixed type. So let us prove this one by applying our rule for calculation. And this 10, according to our rule, will drop the pH by 0.08. So we assume here that the pH will come from 7.35 to 7.27. But we found that it comes to 7.10. So 7.27 minus 7.10, so there is 0.17. This comes from decrease of bicarb. So it is a mixed. And we can assume or calculate how much bicarb lost here. that it will produce this defect in the pH by 0.17, also from the equation. As every decrease in 10 bicarb will drop 0.14, so 0.17 will come by drop of the bicarb by around 12. So if we consider the normal is 22, so we will find that here if the blood gas is complete, the bicarb must be 10. If we consider 26 in a term baby, it will be 14. If the same case, we start to make good ventilation for the baby and good support, and then we repeat the blood gas and found that the PCO2 come down from this 55 to 40, so come down by 15, and we found that the pH come to 7.25. So what is the diagnosis now? The pH is still acidotic, the CO2 is normal, so it is metabolic acidosis. So the decrease from 55 to 40 make the change from the previous pH 7.10 to 7.25, or there is some improvement also in the bicarb, we can also calculate. So this is a metabolic acidosis, and we suspect it will be improved by 0.08, so the pH we suspect that it will be 7.18, not 7.25. So there is some more improvement rather than the respiratory effect by metabolic effect, which creates the difference between 7.25 to 7.18, which is 0.07, which reflect about 5 of bicarb. So assume now that the bicarb which was 10 or 14 will be 15 or 19. So here's the improvement by the respiratory element from the ventilation, and by improvement of the circulation and the improvement of the level of bicarb. If the same baby and later on during the stay on mechanical ventilation we find that the pH start to be more improved to 7.3, while the PCO2 deteriorate to 58. So what is the diagnosis here? 7.3, it is near normal, but still it is acidosis, and the PCO2 is respiratory element, so it is respiratory acidosis. But the pH before was 7.25 and here becomes 7.3. The CO2 become more deteriorated to 58 and it was 40. So this increment or increase in the PCO2 from 40 to 58 by 18, I suspect that the pH will come down from 7.25 to less, not to improve. So I have to here assume that there is some improvement in the level of bicarb. So what is the diagnosis here? It is acidosis and it is respiratory, and for the compensation, yes, and it is partial. How we consider it's partial or not? Let us calculate. The PCO2 improved from increased from 40 to 58, so increased by 18, and this 18 we will assume that it will affect the 7.25 to drop to 7.11 by the calculation. For every 10 will affect by 0.08. But here the pH increase by 0.19. So this 0.19 reflect an increase in the level of bicarb, and we can calculate, if we make the calculation, that every 10 will affect by 0.14. we will find here that expected bicarb increased by 13.5. So the bicarb which was 19 here it will be around 32. So there is partial compensation by bicarb, or if you are giving the baby IV infusion of bicarb, which we are not recommending. If we don't know the previous three ABG before, and we consider that this is the only blood gas which we have a pH of 7.3 and BCO2 of 58, and there is no bicarb level mentioned. So what is the definition of that acidosis? We will consider this respiratory acidosis. But the 58 of BCO2 is responsible to drop the pH from 7.35 to 7.3. So the increment here in the CO2 is from 45 increase to 58. So this 13 will decrease the pH by 0.05. Let us calculate. The pH 7.3, BCO2 58, so it's respiratory acidosis, but the increase of 13 in the CO2, if we make by calculation, it will make drop in the pH by 0.10, and here is a decrease to 7.3 only 0.05. So there is some correction here which is equal to also 0.05. So this correction considered as partial correction, and the respiratory acidosis is still respiratory acidosis, but corrected because we suspect that the pH will be 7.25, decreased by 0.10. Another case, if we have a 40 days baby, 26 weeks, on BTV mode, and the pH here is alkalotic 7.47, and the CO2 is towards the acidotic. There is more by from 45 to 56 by 11, and the bicarb is 34 towards the alkalotic. So what is the diagnosis? We will not say that the CO2 is high, so it will make acidosis. Then there is compensation by the bicarb of the acidosis to the level to make alkalosis. No overcompensation. The pH here is alkalotic, so it is alkalosis, and it is related to the bicarb, so it is metabolic alkalosis. So what is the effect of this CO2? Is it compensation? We will calculate. If it is the same level of the expected CO2, so it is fully compensated. If the CO2 come less, so it is partially compensated. If the CO2 of the 56 is more than the expected, so there is another respiratory factor which causes retention of CO2, so the ventilation must be adjusted. Even if the pH considered not acidotic, but we have to readjust to watch some CO2 according to the calculation. So let us calculate metabolic alkalosis. The expected CO2, this is chronic case, will be 0.7 multiplied the bicarb plus 20 plus or minus 1.5. So we expect for compensation that the CO2 will be 45.3. But now the CO2 is 56. So there is another respiratory element from the unhealthy lung caused CO2 retention, like in chronic lung disease. So this is a mixed disorder of metabolic alkalosis and element of respiratory acidosis. If we have in the sixth example patient with pneumonia with the pH is near normal, it is acidotic still 7.29, and the CO2 here is high 60, so it looks like respiratory acidosis. and the bicarb here toward the alkaline. More bicarb, 31. So looks like that there is some compensation. Let us calculate. What is the expected bicarb for this increase in the CO2? The increase in the CO2 here by 15 from 45 to 60. So this 15. So the expected PCO2 elevation, which is 15 here, how much we will consider that the bicarb to compensate by the calculation, it will be 26, as this is acute case. But here you find that the measured bicarb is 31, not 26. So the body try to compensate to maintain the pH near normal. Why the actual is high? As we said, this is compensatory metabolic alkalosis, or if you are giving the baby infusion by bicarb. What is the expected pH? If we have normal bicarb 26, so if we have normal bicarb 26, there must be more drop in the pH. It will not be 7.29, it will be less. According to the calculation, you will find it will be 7.23. The CO2, which is 60 minus 45 is 15, it will drop the pH by 0.12, so it will be 7.23. So here there is partial compensation. Number 7, patient here with the pH acidotic 7.2, bicarb is very low, so it may be the cause for the acidosis, metabolic acidosis. The CO2 here is 32, so there is some much of CO2. So what is the diagnosis here? It is metabolic acidosis, and the CO2 wash try to compensate. It is full compensation, partial compensation. Let us calculate. The expected CO2 here is 1.5 multiply the 14, which is the bicarb, plus 8 plus or minus 2, so the maximum will be 31, and we have the measured PCO2 is 32, so it is almost fully compensated, almost maximum compensation. If here in this case we found that the CO2 is 47 and the maximum must be 31, so what is the diagnosis here? It is mixed respiratory and metabolic acidosis. But at that time you will find that the pH will not be 7.2. The effect of the higher CO2 will decrease the pH more, so it will be mixed respiratory and metabolic acidosis. The last point about the effectiveness of oxygenation from the blood gas, and as I said, it is reflected by the PO2, which is not so accurate, and you have to have arterial sample, not venous and not capillary. And we are using the term of hypoxemia and hypoxia as the same term, although they are different. Hypoxemia definition, it is decrease in the oxygen content of the blood, so it will reflect the low partial oxygen tension, like in cases of right left shunt or hypoventilation or ventilation perfusion mismatching or inadequate inspiratory PO2. But hypoxia, which you are using like hypoxemia, it is inadequate amount of oxygen available at the tissue, the body in general, or at a specific tissue. So it can be affected by extremely low cardiac output, like in case of cardiogenic shock, in anemia, in case where there is oxygen affinity, increase oxygen affinity, like cases when there is shift to the left of the oxygen curve, as we said before in alkalinity. So hypoxemia and hypoxia are different, but we are using as the same. Especially in preterm, when we have a baby who is anemic, and the level of hemoglobin will affect the state of effective oxygenation of the baby. So by this we finish an important subject, how to interpret the blood gas and how to measure the compensation, to know the metabolic status of your baby and the acid-base balance. And to summarize that, you have first to look and to define does your patient is acidic or alkalotic by looking to the pH. Then second, by looking to the PCO2 and if the bicarb is available to tell about the primary problem. And the third, to measure the compensation and to calculate if the factor which affects the pH, either the CO2 or the carb, is the only factor, it is responsible for all this change in the pH or not. For a primary metabolic problem, you have to calculate the expected PCO2, and if equal to the calculated, then there is absolute respiratory compensation. If it is higher than the calculated, then there is respiratory acidosis also. If lower than calculated, so it is incomplete compensation, or there is component respiratory alkalosis. And then look to the effectiveness of oxygenation, and we got 2 rules and 4 equations which are very important. You have to keep it in your mind. These are also some application and some cases that you can return. It is the same like which we calculated before. Just look at this and how it reflects good assessment of the acid-base balance of your baby. And the lecture will be about the hemodynamic and stable baby and the use of drugs. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.